Hi all and welcome to another chess news video. In this one I want to continue my coverage of the St. Louis Rapid and Blitz, and in particular my coverage of the games of Vachier-Mamedyarov. I want to take a look at his Rapid game that he played with the black pieces against Vachier-Lagrave. Okay, let's start. So Maxime Vachier-Lagrave was white and he opened up the game with e4 and there followed e5. Knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, and now knight f6, the so-called Prussian defense, which normally by the white players is combated with the funny move knight g5 hitting f7, which could in turn lead to the fried liver attack and so on and so on. But white opts for the slightly more modest d2, d3, and now a funny move by Mamedyarov. He plays here h6. And some research shows that Mamedyarov has played this move 5 times already. So he must be on familiar territory. Instead, the more obvious bishop c5 would lead to the so-called giuco pianissimo. This is the line of the Italian game whereby both sides continue their development very quietly, and hence the name pianissimo. Okay, well, back to the game where h6 was played. White continues with castles, and now we saw d6. Okay, very solid setup by black, but you could ask yourself, and maybe the black bishop did, why so many pawns on dark squares, right? Dear Vachier-Mamedyarov, do you think about my future, please? Well, okay, we will see what happens in this game with regards to that bishop. Now the question is, should white in turn now maybe also play h3 as black did to prevent the pin with bishop g4? Well, these things are normally hard to figure out, and a number of factors have to be considered, such as have sides already castled? Can the king's bishop be used to easily neutralize the pin? Can the queen's knight be used to overprotect the king's knight and so release the queen of her defensive duty? Does the pin come with extra pressure against the pawn center? Can the pinning bishop be chased away, etc., etc.? Well, for now, these questions fall outside the scope of this video, but for the students of our Better Your Chess University, I will be making a video discussing these concepts soon. Okay, well, after d6, MVL answered our question in playing rook e1, so he decided not to prevent the pin. Rather, he overprotects his pawn on e4, and he plans probably now the stutter step d3, d4, saying to black, well, I'm going to attack your center, trying to open up the game, while you've been playing these passive moves, you know, such as h7, h6, d7, d6. Well, what are you going to do about that? Well, Mamedyarov had his answer ready. Here comes the very enterprising g5. Very interesting move, I'd like to say. And, well, if not objectively putting pressure, then at least it does so psychologically. Because the idea of g5, g4 does ask some interesting questions. But Maxime did not want to think about the answers and very quickly played d3, d4. But I think that this is an inaccuracy already giving black the easier game. We know the classical rules of chess say an attack on the wing, such as here with g7, g5, should be answered with a counter in the center, such as here d3, d4, right? But although this rule is valuable, it is a more general and abstract rule, and we cannot use abstract solutions for concrete problems. There is a concrete problem right now. Let's count. How many times is the pawn on d4 now attacked, and how many times is it defended? Well, we just go by the green and the yellow arrows. It's 2 against 2. So currently attack and defense are in balance. But normally in chess this does not mean that the situation is safe. Rather, when something's in balance, the situation is unsafe. All that the attacker needs to do is bring in one more attacker or eliminate one more defender, and there's already a mini crisis, right? You have to react. So, well, Mamedyarov must have thought, let's just simply try and chase away one of the defenders, and he played here g5, g4. So it seems that this now forces white to defend by means of a counterattack of similar strength. Because if you now move the knight away, let's say knight h4, then indeed this pawn on d4 is lost, right? And black would be better. That's one way to play. And who does that? Who gives up the pawn in the center like that? Well, MVL didn't do that, and he now played this counterattack with d takes e5. But I feel that this is another inaccuracy. Now, I always preach that if and when possible, an attack should be answered by a counterattack, and statistically speaking, this is very, very true. But I suppose we're in this realm of the 5 to 10%, where in this case it's just inaccurate. The thing is, the moves in the game that follow now leave white's king position compromised for the rest of the game. So it would have been better with hindsight, I say, for white to bite the bullet and sacrifice that pawn with knight h4, allowing knight takes d4. Anyway, let's see how white's king position now does compromise. Of course, black now continues with taking the knight, and white is forced to do the same to try and maintain as much of the material balance as is possible. But now there follows a key move, knight e5, and I feel that this is really the one that secures black's advantage. It first and foremost attacks the undefended bishop on c4, but also makes sure that white's kingside cannot be repaired with queen d1 takes f3. Now you may argue that black's kingside is also ruined, and structurally, if we take a look at the pawns, this is true as well. But black has not castled his king into that area, and this also means that he can still use the g-file for his rook to attack white's king. Okay, now these are very, very important differences. So it's up to white again to try and deal with the situation where he's already a little bit under the gun. And he now made an error, I feel. He played knight d2. And I feel that after this move, white's position becomes really critical. White does give the knight double duty, defending the bishop on c4 and also hoping maybe in the future to take on f3 with the knight, so sidestepping again the fact that he would have to recapture getting doubled pawns on the f-file. But here on d2 the knight is awkwardly placed and immobilizes the white pieces. It's currently impossible, for instance, for the bishop to get out or the queen to get some activity, right? So in hindsight, I feel that instead of knight d2, and because of the aforementioned reasons, knight a3 would have been a bit better, keeping the disadvantage contained. And then if black continues as he did in the game, with queen f3 for instance, then white can opt for g3 and retain more possibilities than in the game. Well, back to the game continuation, where on the 10th move knight d2 was played, but now comes Mamedyarov playing queen takes f6, restoring the material balance and supervising f3 once more. And now it's still very difficult for white, and Bill opts here for g takes f3. Faced with a plethora of evils, he decides to give up the integrity of the kingside himself now. Well, at least now he doesn't have to deal with any pressure moves, such as, let's say, if we just drop back a little bit, such as maybe bishop g4 or bishop h3 or rook g8 or f takes g3 or what have you, I don't know, maybe queen g6, etc, etc. So he just clears up the cobwebs himself. And maybe there were, mathematically speaking, abstractly speaking, slightly better move, but I can understand this decision, this g takes f3. I think the more serious mistake was the one already earlier with knight d2. Okay, Of course, note that it was not possible for white to escape into an endgame with knight takes f3 and then hoping to exchange everything on f3, after which there would be no black queen left to hunt down white's king, because of course here the knight had double duty, so black simply wins now the bishop on c4. That would have been impossible. So in the game, after g takes f3, now with this diagonal completely opened up and the g file also, black starts a direct assault on the king with rook g8 check, and he now has a really significant advantage. Well, there are basically only two moves, and of those two, king f1 is really out of the question. It may seem the safer one of the two, because at least you get out of the corner where normally you'll get stuck and be even more immobile. But you can also not survive in the middle, right? Look at this move. Bishop h3 check, king e2 is forced, and now bishop g2, putting pressure on this vulnerable f3 square even 3 times. Well, what can you do? Let's suppose you defend that square by discovering a defense from the queen to f3 with king e3. But then it really turns out that after d6, d5, and bishop c5 coming and so on, white cannot survive this kind of onslaught. So after rook g8 check, he decided to go into the corner, and he did so very quickly because they must have realized, okay, king f1, bishop h3, king e2, bishop g2 is just lost. You know, they have these very fast calculating abilities and very strong instincts, even though the instincts fail every now and then as well, right? But then again, let's forget it's also rapid. Now, before trying to deal a final blow, black first decides to eliminate the most important defender of the light squares, which is the bishop on c4. He may try to play the immediate bishop h3, threatening a check on g2, but then after bishop f1, things remain tenable for white. So what he does first is knight takes bishop, so that bishop will never be able to defend all 32 light squares on the board, most notably the ones in the bottom right hand quadrants, the quadrant around white's king. And also, more theoretically speaking, this move of course gains him the bishop pair. Now fortunately for white, this knight takes c4 recapture gives the knight also better defensive prospects, you know, because via e3 there's still some defending to do, and it also frees up white's pieces again. The bishop on c1 can move again, the queen can move more freely now over the semi-open d file, etc, etc. So in that sense all is not lost for white yet. But here comes bishop h3. And with the direct threat of winning the queen by means of bishop g2 check and then bishop takes f3 discover check, but also doubling up on the g file with either queen g6 or queen g7 and threatening mate on g2, that is now a deadly threat. And note that without bishop h3, white could still react to that with rook g1. For instance, if instead of bishop h3, black would play here queen g6 threatening checkmate, then rook g1 would still be possible. But in this type of position with the bishop already on h3, then the bishop could deliver this deadly check with bishop g2 and black would be winning. So we understand bishop h3 is really very, very testing move with very deadly threats. So here comes knight e3. Oof. Still in time to stave off the very, very worst. g2 is now protected, and if black moves the queen to the g file, that again can be met with rook g1 because of the fact that g2 is protected. So white's position hangs by a thread, namely the knight on e3. The knight on e3 is the all-important square. So you may wonder, all that black needs to do really is to eliminate the knight, and he should be left with a strategically winning position with opposite color bishops on the board, but also major pieces. So not a drawing tendency, but rather the reverse, a very strong attacking tendency, and a white king side that is severely weakened on the light squares. And who has the bishop of the light squares? Indeed, it is black. Okay, now here Mamedyarov played h5, one of two ways in which black tries to eliminate knight e3, because it seems that he is preparing bishop h6, the bishop that was hampered by the pawns from the opening, and then bishop h6 takes e3. Okay, yeah, and eliminating the knight is also a goal that can really only be achieved by black's dark square bishop, right? So that's the only piece that can easily give itself for the knight on e3. Now in this case, or this moment I should say, the St. Louis commentary team thought that this, however, was an inaccuracy, this h6, h7, and suggested that long castles should have been played instead. I don't necessarily agree. Let's compare. Let's see what happens here after castles. It is a very good move, I think, but now knight g4 is possible. And come to think of it, it was maybe this knight move that prompted Mamedyarov to play h5, and not even the idea of bringing the bishop to h6, because later on he doesn't follow up with bishop h6, and I find that very funny. Yes, it does explain what happens on the next move. But here after queen g6, let's say rook g1, h5 now, knight e3. I think that, well, black still has the better of it after the exchange on g1, and then still playing bishop h6, going into an endgame. But maybe Mamedyarov didn't like this. Maybe he just didn't want to play an endgame, right? Long castles is good, but if we take a look, which move is faster with regards to eliminating the knight on e3, long castles, or the move Mamedyarov played in the game, h6, h5. Let's go back one move and count, yeah? This is 1, this is 2, and this would have been 3. Okay, now let's count the moves after long castles. 1, 2, 3, 4. So the idea of eliminating the knight on e3 with long castles and then d5, bishop c5 takes e3, takes one more move. And it will probably prompt Richard III to say, a kingdom for a move, a kingdom for a move, you know, because we chess players, we know that if only we had an extra move, we could do this or we could do that, right? So I'm not so sure. h5 also strikes me as a strong move. It does prepare bishop h6. Whether he actually plays it or not in the game doesn't really matter. And also it prevents knight g4, right? So, well, I like the move. So let's see what happened after h5. So, well, what can MVL do? He also has to finish his development, right? The knight is currently sitting on e3 and should remain there, I think. So he plays bishop d2, connecting the rooks and trying to finish his development. I think ideally he wants to play rook g1 only when he can recapture with the other rook, because if he has to recapture with the king, then the king is always vulnerable to the second black rook appearing on the g file, and the same holds true for if he has to recapture with the queen recapture on g1. And let's not forget that it's really never possible for the queen to recapture on g1, because the queen has to defend this target, right? So what white is envisaging is probably something like queen e2, which keeps an eye on the f pawn, and only then play rook g1. So that also explains why he starts with bishop d3, really. Now, funnily enough, there was absolutely nothing wrong with the consistent bishop h6. Just trying to eliminate the knight on g2, the knight on e3, defending the g2 square, and then trying for all those tricks on the light squares again. For instance, if white now answers rook g1, then he's losing after rook takes g1, king takes g1, not allowing queen f3 check, eliminating the knight. And now here comes the next check on the g file. And it turns out that white has simply mated over the light squares, right? So that's already one way how black could win the game after bishop h3. Also f4 can be tried, which breaks the connection, right, between the bishop and the queen. And in this case, because of a coincidence, it is not very good to recapture with the queen in the hope of, again, on the next move, eliminating this knight, because now white all of a sudden has the pinning move, queen f3. So then Mamedyarov would have had to switch with queen takes f4. But of course, again, after queen e2 and castles queenside, he still would have a very serious advantage. But maybe this would have been the most tenacious way to play, because at least there's material balance, if you could say that. We always like the bishop pair, of course. But rook g1 is in the position, and it feels that here white may indeed have better defensive possibilities, now that he gets to keep his knight a little bit longer on the e3 square. Anyway, and last but not least, after bishop h6, and this is probably the most noteworthy variation and probably the one that tripped up Mamedyarov, is what happens then after bishop c3. I mean, I can now eliminate the knight on e3, but then you'll just take my queen on f6, right? But then queen g6 is possible, and now some calculation was needed and some appreciation of what is going on. And maybe Mamedyarov, I don't know, he couldn't quite see it through to the end, because what to do after rook g1? Now you can eliminate the knight on e3, because after rook takes g6 and rook takes g6, the white king still has a problem. And if you recapture now, we can regain white's queen with the discovered attack again. The one we saw earlier in the game, right? That one didn't walk away. As a matter of fact, we wanted to reinstate it by eliminating the knight on e3. So here in this position, it turns out that this is just a position with an exchange up, so technically winning. I'm sure that if Mamedyarov had seen this, he would have played like this. But maybe he was already playing with the idea of long castles after he played h6, a5, and only played that move to prevent knight g4, right? But it would have made so much sense to play bishop h6 here. I think, objectively speaking, this clearly would have been the best move. Because now, instead of playing the consistent bishop h6, he now switches back to the other plan with longside castles. And I feel that with this move he slips up and loses a significant portion of his advantage now. Well, MVL continues with his plan of development, also preparing a subtle lateral defense that we will see a little bit later on. And black now tries to arrest the knight in another way. The main threat is now d5, d4, simply chasing away the knight and again reinstating all those light squared threats. Also, alternative deployments of bishop f8 are prepared, such as bishop d6 maybe, or still bishop c5, what have you, etc, etc. And it turned out that because the queen is now already on e2, that bishop h6 no longer works like a charm, because now bishop c3 does work. Let's take a look. Queen g6, we try the same situation again, the same variation. Rook g1, and now this falls short, because after takes on g6, takes on g6, now all of a sudden we have f takes e3, and the queen is laterally defending the g2 square. Okay, I think black still has a draw if he now doubles up on the g file and just goes for the white king, but it's no longer a win anymore. I invite you to try and figure that out for yourself at home. Back to the game where d6, d5 was played. And now rook g1. Finally, MVL gets to defend the g file. By the way, one way of going horribly wrong still was e takes d5, because after bishop d6 we see that this very, very strong bishop will hit the white king side from another angle. It's very difficult, if not impossible, to stop the mating threat with queen e5 or f4, and here white is just dead in the water. But these guys, I mean, they see it or they realize it, you know. So it's impressive. Rook g1 was played. So here goes rook takes g1, rook takes g1, and now crashing through in the center. And after f takes e4 and queen takes b2, now that white has his own king side somewhat consolidated, Mamedyarov decides that there are also other ways in which chess games can be won. He continues now in a more positional style, restoring material balance and relying on his pair of bishops. And the weak white king, even though consolidated slightly for the moment, may become a theme later in the game. And wink, 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 it will. Okay, you could say, why not knight d5 now, right? Revenge of the knight. It was a very serious alternative. But Maxime Vachier-Lagrave went pawn hunting. Queen takes h5. And he is moving his queen into a more aggressive position, but in a way also in a less defensive position. And well, it's exciting, but for the moment he is again a pawn up and attacking the bishop on h3. So we can understand the move. Bishop e6, consolidating the light squares here, the bishop and the pawn, right? And here comes another very aggressive move, rook g8. But I think that this again is a mistake. He leaves his back rank undefended, and that will have consequences later on. Mamedyarov could have capitalized here with the strong discovered attack f7, f5. It hits both the rook on g8 and the pawn on e5. And now there are some opportunities here. Let's take a look, for instance, at rook h8. But then after f4, black really has a very, very strong position. He chases away the knight and can continue the attack on the light squares after that. Also rook g1, back to the bank rank, allows queen d4 with a double attack on the undefended bishop on d2 and the pawn on e4. So black gets to snap off that bishop after bishop c1, queen takes e4, and of course, well, here he also has a winning position again. Well, then what remains maybe as a try, a very nasty try after f7, f5, is a counterattack against black's undefended queen with the surprising queen h8. Now don't take the rook, because then you will lose your queen, but rather play queen a3, defending your own bishop and asking white, well, I'm still attacking your rook, I'm still attacking your pawn, what are you going to do about it? Well, play may continue with rook g6, counter-attacking, bishop f7, counter-attacking, rook f7, counter-attacking, queen f7, counter-attacking and defending. And now after, let's say, rook f5, the bishop on d2 is falling. So again, black would reach a winning position. But after rook g8, Mamedyarov did not play f5, which also pressures the e4 pawn, but he played slightly more modestly with f6, so only hitting the rook. Funny, right? But still, he has the better of the game. Rook h8 was played. Here comes the centralizing move, queen d4, hitting with the bishop on d2 and the pawn on e4. Here comes queen a5, at least protecting the bishop and trying for some counterattack against black's king. And now finally some light squared success after all. Queen takes e4, restoring the material balance, and of course forcing the king back to the g file, where the king still is not secure, obviously. a6 was played, just keeping his own king position completely consolidated. And now after bishop c3, it most definitely is losing. White not only had abandoned his back rank, but now he also abandons the d-file. Of course it was difficult to keep the d-file clogged up, but, and this is probably the most beautiful move of the game, Vachier now finds an absolutely brilliant solution to win the game. You may have a good position, you know, but it still doesn't mean that you can relax, and it still means that somehow you have to translate all these positive imbalances, all these advantages in your position into some sort of a winning continuation. And then more often than not, you'll just have to somehow, I don't know what's the correct English expression, you just have to go beyond yourself a little bit and play very pointed chess, very neat, tactical, Swiss watch click 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 chess. And here he plays a very beautiful move. He plays bishop d5, and the way that his mind is thinking is probably that if I can get my queen to h1, it's checkmate, right? Now why is that not yet possible? Well, because the queen is no longer, or not yet, protected on g1. Well, then let's threaten queen h1. What's the only way to do that? Well, it's with bishop d5, right? Yes, but then he can take my bishop and still queen h1 would not be possible. But let's wait, I can recapture then with the rook, and not only am I threatening this horrible check, I'm also threatening the queen, and I'm also threatening this checkmate attack. Wait a second. But wait, then he can play rook takes h8 check. But wait, then after king d7 he still has the same problems, those 3 deadly checks. Can he prevent all 3 of them? And then Mamedyarov is the world number 3. Takes a close look, takes some time, calculates it one more, and he finds out that in this position White is just lost. And this is exactly how the game went. There was still some fight left in MVL, because there is still this check, but of course black simply sidesteps that check, and now there's only one more check, but this just simply prolongs the agony. But after king e7 there is still this check, but then you can block and you're now up the exchange, and you still have threats against White's king. But then there's still this check, but it's now a matter of playing technical moves, king f7, and then the only check left really is this one. But then after the counter check you exchange queens and you remain up the exchange in the endgame, and then you just start picking up all those weak white pawns. The final, well, the final fight was fought with bishop b4, because then after rook c7 you can still protect your pawn on c2, but now after b7, b6, preparing to eliminate the defender of the weak, of the weak c-pawn, MVL decided to throw in the towel and resigned the game. Well, I thought that was a brilliant game by Mamedyarov, and it really shows his playing style and how well and interesting he's doing of late. And all that for a rapid game, I must say, kudos to him. Here he really outclassed another world top player. Okay, well, what's left for me to say? I suppose it's SLC, right? St. Louis Chess. Please subscribe, like and comment if you've liked this video. Learn something from it, hopefully. And then I will thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye.